From Laang Spean to the Khmer Rouge. A History of Cambodia. Introduction. The marvel of the world. Imagine you're a world traveller in the medieval era, a figure like Marco Polo who traversed tens of thousands of kilometres over and back across Eurasia over a period of decades in the 13th century, or the even more impressive Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta, who in the early 14th century eclipsed Marco Polo by travelling over 50,000 kilometres around Africa, the Middle East and Europe. Our intrepid imaginary traveller of a similar time period might have made it to the greatest city in the world at that time. But it was not Constantinople, Rome, Paris, Cairo, Baghdad, Mecca or Beijing, many of which Polo and Battuta visited. Instead, our imaginary traveller would have had to visit what we now term Cambodia to reach the greatest city in the world in the 14th century. Its name was Angkor, and far from simply being a temple complex, as it is all too often simplified as being today, it was actually the largest city in the world and the thriving centre of the greatest power of Southeast Asia at the time, the Khmer Empire. It is a sign of how powerful Cambodia once was, and yet its modern history is much more tragic, characterised by colonisation, independence struggles, political instability, authoritarianism, and a truly horrendous genocide. This is the story of the very complex history of Cambodia. The Laang Spean cave complex, Southeast Asia, has been inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years by descendants of modern Homo sapiens. However, there is only concrete evidence of major settlement points in what is now Cambodia stretching back around 70,000 years to the Laang Spean cave complex, or the Cave of Bridges, in Battambang province in the northwest of the country. The name Cave of Bridges derives from the fact that limestone arches resembling bridges have formed over millennia here, as parts of the large cave vaults have collapsed. The settlement at Laang Spean Cave has really only been known about for the last half-century, after extensive archaeological work was undertaken here in the late 1960s, surveys that were later interrupted by the violence which swept across Cambodia in the 1970s and the 1980s. What this archaeological work has revealed is that inhabitants of this cave complex were producing primitive stone tools around 70,000 years ago. By the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, other inhabitants of the caves had begun to make more advanced tools and were hunting extensively for animals, like rhinos and monkeys, the bone remains of which are present in the cave site. Thousands of years later, by the time the pyramids of Egypt were being built on the other side of Asia, the caves were still being used, though they had possibly switched to primarily being a ceremonial burial site by that later time. This constitutes the most important early settlement point ever discovered in Cambodia and points towards the early history of the region. Cultural osmosis from China and India. Cambodia's cultural and societal development was slower than many other parts of the world in ancient times. While great civilizations were emerging in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Eastern China, and the Indus River Valley, Indochina remained comparatively underdeveloped. The Bronze Age and Iron Age arrived here later. For instance, advanced kinds of pottery only began to appear in Indochina in the 4th millennium BC, considerably later than in West Asia, while the Iron Age really began to take hold here while the Romans were conquering the Mediterranean, nearly 1,000 years after the Iron Age had started in the Middle East. What really started to change Indochina, including the territory now covered by Cambodia, was the arrival of more advanced cultural systems and ideas from both India and China. The impact of this is seen in the wider geographical name of the region, Indochina. This term encapsulates how this part of Southeast Asia lies between India and China, and also how the region covered by Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam and Thailand was profoundly impacted upon over the millennia by wider developments in its larger and more powerful neighbours. Early on, this included the importation of new systems of government and economic activity, which allowed for the development of more complex city-states and kingdoms, as well as new cultural movements. In particular, both Buddhism and Hinduism were brought to the region by missionaries from India between the middle of the 1st millennium BC and the early 1st millennium AD. Buddhism, in particular, would become a defining feature of life in the region, shaping the culture of the region, including its architecture and the way of life of its most powerful pre-modern states. Even to this day, over 90% of Cambodians identify as Buddhists. It was this Indian contact with Cambodia which would ultimately result in the modern name for the country as well. Cambodia is a modern Anglo-French rendering of the word Kampuchea, which in turn is derived from the Sanskrit term Kambujadesha, which combines the words Cambodia and Desa. These are Sanskrit words meaning land of the Camboyas, a reference to the Indian belief that the people here were descended from a sage by the name of Kambu. The Funan Kingdom. Cultural osmosis from China and India into Indochina was quickly followed by the emergence of the first major power in the lands of Cambodia. The Funan Kingdom began to emerge around the 1st century AD. The exact nature of it is still debated. Some scholars believe it was more like a loose alliance of city-states spread out across southern Vietnam, Cambodia, and parts of northeastern Thailand. This is probably how the state first came into existence, as city-states here banded together to resist the power of Champa, another power to the northeast in what is now northern Vietnam. Over time, Funan became more centralized and developed into a major regional power. The history of Funan has to be reconstructed from fragmentary archaeological evidence and Chinese histories and annals, many of which suggest that by the time of its peak in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the rulers of Funan commanded large fleets around the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea. This suggests they were contributing in a way to the extensive maritime trade from China all the way to India, and from India to the Roman ports of the Red Sea. The Chenla Kingdom. Funan declined from the late 5th century onwards, but it was soon replaced by greater powers. We see this primarily in the emergence of the Khmer Empire from the 9th century onwards, which we will return to very soon. But prior to this, the Chenla or Genla Kingdom emerged here. Historians still debate whether or not this was a distinct, centralized state, as most of our information about it comes from outside writers who described it from a geographical and chronological distance. For instance, Zhou Daguan, an early 14th century Chinese scholar who travelled to Indochina at the very peak of the Khmer Empire, wrote about the Chenla Kingdom as a precursor to the Khmer Empire in his book, The Customs of Cambodia. Still, it's not entirely clear if the Chenla Kingdom was a cohesive state or more of a loose confederacy of city-states around Cambodia between the 6th and 9th centuries AD. Moreover, other sources divide the region into land Chenla and water Chenla, suggesting that there were two distinct Chenla states, one close to the Gulf of Thailand in the south and west, and the other inland in the north and east. Whatever the exact nature of the Kingdom of Chenla might have been, what is clear is that it acted as a precursor for the development of the much more significant Khmer Empire. The rise of the Khmer Empire. The roots of the Khmer Empire lie in the early 9th century, though it would evolve over hundreds of years and really reached its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. This means that it was comparable to a power like the Carolingian Empire of the Franks, on the other side of Eurasia, in terms of its evolution over hundreds of years. In medieval times, the Carolingian Empire, for instance, evolved out of the Kingdom of the Franks between the 5th and 8th centuries before peaking in the 9th, and then quickly dissolving into numerous successor states in the 10th century. The Khmer Empire is known by this name in recognition that the dominant ethno-linguistic people involved in the building up of this power in Cambodia and beyond were the Khmer, an Austroasiatic group who had settled here millennia earlier, even though the name itself, as we have seen, is a Sanskrit term. The first Khmer ruler of note in the region emerged late on in the time of the Chenla Kingdom. His name was King Jayavarman II, a ruler over part of Lower Chenla, or Water Chenla. His reign came from around 780 AD onwards and lasted for decades well into the 9th century. Such was the expansion of his Khmer domain that by the end of his rule, a distinct Khmer power was emerging in the region which superseded the Chenla Kingdom. A major element of his rule was the manner in which he asserted Khmer power, independent of any outside interference by the Chinese. He also adopted the title Chakravartin in the year 802 AD, which transliterates as Universal Ruler, a title of imperium in which he aspired to be an emperor. This can be identified as the distinct date from which the Khmer Empire began to emerge. Its power grew substantially over the next 2 centuries, and it began to dominate most of the southern parts of Indochina. Eventually, by the 11th century, the Khmer Empire would extend to cover most of modern-day Cambodia and Laos, much of the southern half of Vietnam, and parts of northern and northeastern Thailand. They even controlled some territory down the Malay Peninsula, though in the process this began to create the first stages of rivalry between Cambodia and Thailand, which have persisted in one shape or another down to modern times, with border rivalries flaring in the summer of 2025. The Khmer Empire at its height. The Khmer Empire is primarily known today on account of Angkor Wat. This is known in the popular imagination as a great temple complex, but in reality the temples that survive there today were just one component of one of the greatest cities of the middle of the second millennium. Angkor had been developed as the capital of the Khmer Empire as early as the 9th century, and by the 13th had grown to become a sprawling metropolis of an estimated 750,000 people, a size which possibly means that it was the largest city in the world around 1250 AD. Importantly, the city lay at the very heart of the Khmer Empire and is an example of the hydrological cities which the Khmer built. These were urban centres which were built with large aqueducts and reservoirs that collected and stored the heavy rain that fell in the monsoon season here. They then used the stored water in the warm, drier months for cultivating rice and other staple crops. These developments point towards the prowess of the Khmer as engineers. As noted, while Angkor was an immense city, today it is primarily known for Angkor Wat, the great temple complex that formed part of the city. Work on this site began in the 12th century. Curiously, it was originally intended to be a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, but as it was under construction, Khmer rulers changed their mind and began converting it into a place of Buddhist worship. This is reflective of developments in Indochina under Khmer rule, as Theravada Buddhism began to eclipse Hinduism in the region. Thus, by the time it was broadly completed in the 13th century, Angkor Wat was dedicated to an entirely different religious system to the one it had originally been built to honour. It was a vastly impressive edifice. For instance, it is surrounded by a moat that is over 5 kilometres in length. An outer wall is then inside this, followed by 3 rectangular galleries in raised tiers. Large conical towers and cone-shaped buildings then dominate the main temple complex as a series of shrine and temples. The entire site covers more than 1.6 million square metres, over 3 times the size of the Vatican City. The strange thing about the Khmer Empire is that while its ascent was slow and sustained over several centuries, it declined very dramatically after reaching the peak of its military, political and cultural power between the middle of the 12th and the early 14th centuries. There were numerous reasons for this. Some of the Khmer Empire's neighbours were becoming more powerful and aggressive. Trade routes were also reorientating, perhaps a delayed result of the opening of the vast Silk Roads across Eurasia by the Mongols in the 13th century, following the conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors, with the Mongols bringing Chinese silk and jade across Central Asia to the Middle East. The socio-economic power of the Khmer and their control of the maritime route from southern China to India declined. However, perhaps the greatest factor in the quite sudden demise of the Khmer Empire was ecological. Archaeologists and climate historians now believe that severe droughts impacted on the region in the 13th and 14th centuries, and this undermined the complex system of water retention and use which the Khmer used to sustain their way of life. As this happened, the Khmer Empire declined, a process which climaxed in 1431 when the neighbouring kingdom of Ayutthaya in Thailand, a newly emergent regional power, sacked the city of Angkor. The Post-Angkor era. The end of the Khmer Empire ushered in a period of decline in Cambodia, generally termed the Post-Angkor era by historians. During this time, Cambodia was eclipsed by more powerful neighbours, notably by the resurgence of power in China under the Ming dynasty that seized control of the country in 1368, after over a century of rule by a foreign Mongol dynasty there. The Ming reached the peak of their powers in the 15th century, when huge naval expeditions were sent out to reassert China's influence over the South China Sea, Indochina, and beyond. At the same time, new powers like the Kingdom of Ayutthaya emerged in what is now Thailand. That Cambodia experienced a prolonged period of foreign domination is seen in the fact that there is a nearly 200-year-long span of time after the Khmer Empire collapsed, in which there are virtually no records of local rulers in Cambodia itself. It was only in the 18th century that we begin to see the re-emergence of Cambodian monarchs who were capable of expressing their independence from their more powerful neighbours again. Indeed, the emergence of these new Cambodian monarchs came about through the appointment of viceroys by the Vietnamese to ruler over Cambodia, who gradually acquired more independence in the 18th century, as Vietnam was racked by civil wars and the southward expansion of Qing dynasty China. Early European encounters. The Post-Angkor era was also the period in which Cambodia began encountering Europeans merchants, missionaries and explorers directly for the first time. Trade between Indochina and the Mediterranean world had been underway for millennia, though using intermediaries like Indian traders who shipped goods from Southeast Asia and sold it to Roman traders sailing out of the ports of the Red Sea. The 16th century was the period in which Europeans first began to arrive to Southeast Asia in person and attempt to acquire knowledge of the region and establish trade connections. The Portuguese had a head start of nearly a century, as it was they who had found the sea route around Africa to Asia at the very end of the 15th century. India and the East Indies were their primary goals, and so it was the 1580s before the first concerted visits to Indochina by Portuguese explorers and missionaries like Antonio de Madalena were made. He visited the ruins of Angkor Wat and thus became one of the first Europeans to ever lay eyes on the site. By the 17th century, Spanish, Dutch, English and French explorers, missionaries and merchants were showing an interest in Southeast Asia and seeking to establish colonies here. They were more interested, though, in the two more powerful neighbours of the Khmer, the Ayutthaya Kingdom in Thailand and the Kingdom of Dai Viet in Vietnam. For instance, the French attempted to establish a kind of protectorate in Ayutthaya in the 1680s, but this was beyond their capabilities in such a faraway land at the time. It was the same country that would later return to end Cambodia's independence in the 19th century. French colonisation. Cambodia remained squeezed between its more powerful neighbours into the 18th and 19th centuries. Then a distinct shift began to occur in the politics of the Far East. With the advent of the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution in Europe, countries like Britain, France and the Dutch Republic made rapid technological advances, ones which allowed them to travel to the other side of the world swiftly on board steamships, armed with advanced artillery and guns, and eventually even the first primitive machine guns, while their systems of mapping, governance and bureaucracy meant that a small army of a few hundred Europeans could reduce vast parts of Asia and Africa to European rule. This was made even easier in the case of Southeast Asia from 1869 after the Suez Canal opened in Egypt, cutting the travel time from Europe to the Far East by more than half, a voyage that had already been shortened considerably by the advent of ocean-going steamships in the 1840s. Britain and other countries would soon be acquiring vast new colonies and influence all over the world as a result of these developments. It was the French who benefited in Indochina. They began the conquest of Vietnam at the end of the 1850s, while the Second Opium War was simultaneously underway further north between the Chinese against the British, French and Russians. In 1863, after the French had captured Saigon and annexed the southern provinces of what is now Vietnam, the Cambodian king, Norodom, signed a treaty with Emperor Napoleon III of France, in which he effectively became a French vassal in return for protection from the Kingdom of Siam next door in Thailand. This situation continued until 1907, when the French-Siamese Treaty saw Siam cede further territory in what is now Cambodia to the French. Hence, from 1907 onwards, all of Cambodia was effectively part of the wider colonial enclave of French Indochina covering Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. The Cambodian monarchy was allowed to remain in place, but effectively France's rule held sway here from the 1860s onwards and grew more powerful over time. Cambodia. During the World Wars, Cambodia was a part of French Indochina throughout the era of the two world wars of the first half of the 20th century. The stories of colonial contributions of people from the African and Asiatic colonies to the First World War have only been retrieved from obscurity in the last several decades. For instance, it is not appreciated until the last quarter of a century or so that hundreds of thousands of Indians from the British Raj were sent to fight for the British against the Germans on the Western Front in France. Admittedly, the role of Indochina was more limited. It was not impacted on in any major direct way by the fighting. However, in 1916, the French agreed with King Sisawat of Cambodia that he would issue a royal decree encouraging his people to volunteer to go and fight for the French in Europe. Around 2,500 light infantry came forward as a result. Others were conscripted, either as soldiers, auxiliaries, or in ancillary roles. In the end, as many as 20,000 Cambodians were sent to Europe, though many were deployed late and did not see much action before the war ended. A memorial in the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh, records the names of 151 Cambodians who died in Europe during the First World War. The scale of the impact of the Second World War on Cambodia was much more drastic. The conquest of France by Nazi Germany in a swift campaign in May and June 1940 effectively cut the new Vichy collaborationist regime in southern France off from French Indochina, as Britain still controlled the Suez Canal and the vast waterways of the Indian Ocean. At the same time, the Empire of Japan was allying more closely with the Nazis, and in September 1940, the Japanese began occupying parts of Indochina, though at first they limited their engagement here to critical ports in Vietnam, and so forth. This process expanded in the summer of 1941, when Cambodia was effectively occupied. Some provinces were eventually taken over by neighbouring Thailand, which had allied with Japan in the belief that it would emerge victorious in the war in the Far East. Within Cambodia, a peculiar arrangement prevailed whereby the Japanese were effectively in control, but elements of the French Indochinese colonial administration were allowed to remain in place to placate the Vichy government back in France. Cambodia would not see a huge level of fighting once the war in the Far East dramatically escalated after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the entry of the United States into the war. Simply put, Indochina was not a strategic concern, and the fighting between the Allies and the Japanese focused on places the India-Burma front, China, and the islands of the Western Pacific. Where Indochina was involved, the Allies tried to strike at strategic targets like the ports of Vietnam with bombing missions. Cambodia was not a strategic priority. Some internal resistance to the Japanese occupation, such as the Umbrella Demonstration of July 1942, did develop, but overall Cambodia's place in the war was more limited than others. It remained broadly under Japanese rule until the end of the Second World War in the autumn of 1945, when huge parts of Southeast Asia were liberated very swiftly after the Japanese surrendered. The independence struggle. The end of the Second World War ushered in a more intense struggle within Indochina. Britain and France were hugely weakened by the war against the Germans in Europe, and they had also made promises to various colonial people during the struggle about independence after the war in return for aid during it. Thus, for instance, the British Raj acquired its independence from Britain in 1947 and split into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan, the latter of which also initially included what is now Bangladesh. There was at least a negotiated withdrawal in British India. In French Indochina, the situation was different again. Various resistance groups had arisen during the Japanese occupation in Cambodia, Laos, and especially Vietnam. Many of these had received aid from the Chinese and Soviet communists and were now aligning themselves with the communist camp in the developing Cold War. Thus, although the French tried to reimpose colonial rule across Indochina in the aftermath of the Second World War and the defeat of Japan, they were facing an uphill struggle from the autumn of 1945 as various resistance movements emerged across the region. These wars of independence would overlap with each other in significant ways for the next 30 years. In Cambodia, the French attempted to work with the traditional monarchy to try and maintain control over the country. This meant granting King Norodom Sihanouk, who had risen to the throne right around the time of the Japanese occupation, an increased amount of power and internal government autonomy. This limited self-government, for instance, saw parliamentary elections held in Cambodia in 1946. However, these concessions by the French were not enough to prevent a communist guerrilla campaign commencing against the French and the Cambodian monarchy that same year, as part of the wider First Indochina War that lasted from 1946 to 1954. In this struggle, the French always viewed Cambodia and Laos as secondary priorities to retaining control over Vietnam with its wealthier coastal cities. Thus, in 1953, as they were losing the wider conflict and focused their resources on Vietnam, the French granted Cambodia its independence. A year later, the Geneva Agreements effectively saw French rule in Indochina come to an end as they accepted defeat in the region. Cambodia and the Vietnam War, the end of the First Indochina War in 1954, and the acquisition of independence by Cambodia in 1953 was really only the first stage in the long and bitter post-war struggles that face Cambodia and Indochina more broadly. King Sihanouk abdicated in 1955 to pursue a political career, although the ceremonial Cambodian monarchy remained in existence. The attempted shift towards a constitutional monarchy was completely stymied, though, by events in the wider region. The Geneva Agreements of 1954 had laid out steps for Vietnam to be divided into a communist North Vietnam and a Western-aligned state in South Vietnam, which presented as a democracy, but which in effect was ruled by a series of autocrats backed by the United States. As tensions grew between the North and South in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, the US was drawn into sending thousands of troops to South Vietnam to prevent the whole of the country being brought under communist rule. The Second Indochina War was effectively underway from 1955 down to 1975, though it is usually most closely identified with the 1960s and is often termed the Vietnam War from an American perspective. Effectively, as the war between the Soviet-backed North Vietnam and the US-backed South Vietnam escalated, hundreds of thousands of US Marines were conscripted and sent to Indochina. Cambodia's hopes of transitioning to a stable constitutional monarchy were dashed in the process. The North Vietnamese began using Cambodian territory as a means of sending troops south to fight their guerrilla war against the US in South Vietnam, and Cambodian communist guerrillas and other groups continued to fight the post-independence government within Cambodia. Soon the former king, Sihanouk, who had become the head of the government in 1960, began to align more closely with the North Vietnamese in the hopes of uniting Cambodia under his rule. This would eventually result in the United States deciding to start bombing campaigns against Cambodia at the end of the 1960s. Sihanouk was overthrown in 1970 and headed into exile in China, from where he commenced his own guerrilla war against the newly established Khmer Republic, a US-backed military dictatorship that ruled Cambodia between 1970 and 1975. Yet it was not Sihanouk that would lead the resistance to the Khmer Republic for long. Instead, the Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, began to increase the amount of territory under their control as the US began a phased withdrawal from Indochina in the early 1970s. When the US pulled out of South Vietnam entirely in 1975 and the country fell to the North Vietnamese, the US-backed Khmer Republic met the same fate in Cambodia. 2 weeks before the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, the Khmer Republic was overthrown in Cambodia, and the Khmer Rouge communist regime came to power. The Khmer Rouge and the killing fields. The communists in Cambodia played a key role in the country's independence struggle and post-colonial politics. That said, the word communist should probably be used in the loosest sense when referring to the Khmer Rouge, or Communist Party, of Kampuchea, the organisation that claimed power in 1975 in the febrile political and military environment of Cambodia's politics as the Vietnam War was coming to an end next door. For instance, the Khmer Rouge leader Pol Pot was on record as stating that he had tried to read some of the works of the communist writer Karl Marx and hadn't really understood what any of it meant. Like many other anti-colonial movements, the leaders of the Khmer Rouge basically stated that they were communists in order to acquire weapons and support from the Soviet Union and the Communist government of China. This view of the Khmer Rouge as having nothing to do with communism in reality is further cemented when we examine what the Khmer Rouge actually did when they seized power in Cambodia in the mid-1970s. While communism advocates for industrialization in large cities as a precursor to both socialism and then communism, the Khmer Rouge leaders actually began trying to create a mass agrarian society and began forcibly removing people from the cities and towns back to the countryside to grow rice in the paddy fields. This inverted version of so-called communism soon began to devolve into genocide as the Khmer Rouge began urging Cambodians to attack and kill the ideological enemies of the regime. The bizarre nature of the brutal Cambodian genocide was such that it was not actually directed by one ethnic group against another, but rather Khmer officials and their followers butchering their fellow Cambodians in what became known as the Killing Fields. It is believed that somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million of Cambodia's 8 million people died in the genocide before the insane Khmer Rouge were removed from power in 1979 after Vietnam invaded the country to stop the killing there. This brought to an end one of the darkest periods of post-Second World War history anywhere in the world. Modern Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge were removed from power in 1979, though they would continue to fight a guerrilla war from the region along the border with Thailand for nearly 20 years. Pol Pot would remain at large for much of the remainder of his life, and only a few of those involved in leading the genocide were belatedly prosecuted decades later. Nor has Cambodia exactly transitioned to a modern democracy since. Pro-Vietnamese parties remained in power through the first half of the 1980s, before a Cambodian politician by the name of Hun Sen claimed power in 1985. Although he oversaw the restoration of a ceremonial monarchy in 1993, the country has remained a dictatorship ever since. For instance, Hun Sen was prime minister elected through fraudulent elections successively between 1998 and 2023. After a quarter of a century, he relinquished power to his son, Hun Manet. Hence, Cambodia has become a hereditary dictatorship. The country has also continued to experience some regional difficulties, notably border clashes with Thailand in the north of Cambodia that flared into an especial bout of violence in the summer of 2025. While there may be little political liberty in the country, Cambodia has begun to prosper economically, comparative to its past in the 19th and 20th centuries. The economy grew by a whopping 20%, for instance, in 1987, as it began to emerge from decades of war and destruction. Between the mid-1990s and the 2010s, it averaged around 7% or 8% of annual growth, as Cambodia has adopted the same economic model followed by China decades ago, and now favoured by countries like Vietnam and Thailand, building electronic goods and other commodities for cheap prices for Western markets. Cambodia will continue to grow, though its future remains uncertain politically and economically, in an increasingly precarious world system.